A millionaire's wife thought she could humiliate her pregnant maid in front of hundreds of guests. But when the maid began to sing, the truth stunned everyone. And what the millionaire did next? It shocked the entire wedding and changed her life forever. In a city where the rich lived behind tall gates and marble walls, there was a quiet woman named Elena. She was only 22, yet life had already forced her to carry burdens far heavier than her fragile shoulders could bear. She worked as a maid in the mansion of a well-known millionaire and his wife. The job wasn't easy, but it was the only thing standing between her unborn child and the cold streets outside. Elena's belly was beginning to show. She was 5 months pregnant, and every morning when she rose before sunrise, she felt the weight of her child pressing against her ribs, reminding her that she wasn't only working for herself anymore. She was working for a future, one she desperately prayed would be brighter than her past. If this story touched your heart, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more powerful justice stories. Share this video with someone who believes in kindness over cruelty, because in the end, compassion always wins. Her husband, gone. When he found out she was pregnant, he left without a second thought, leaving her with nothing but shame, debts, and a heart that had nearly broken beyond repair. For weeks she had slept in a tiny rented room, crying silently at night. But when the chance to work at the millionaire's mansion appeared, she grabbed it without hesitation. The mansion was nothing like the world Elena came from. Chandeliers glittered like captured stars. Floors shined so bright they almost reflected her tired face. Every corner smelled of expensive perfumes, roses flown in from foreign lands and freshly polished wood. To Elena, it was a palace, but it was also a prison, because while the house sparkled, her heart grew heavier each day under the cruelty of the millionaire's wife, Madame Cassandra. Cassandra was known in the city for her beauty, her fashion, and her arrogance. Her words were sharp as knives, and she made sure Elena felt every cut. "Walk faster, you clumsy girl. Even pregnant women in my circles move with more grace than you. Don't touch the silverware with your filthy hands. Do you know how much that costs? More than your entire life." Each insult dug deep into Elena's soul, but she swallowed her tears. She couldn't afford to fight back. Every coin she earned was saved carefully in a small wooden box hidden under her bed. She imagined one day holding her baby in her arms, whispering, "You will never know this kind of pain. Mama will protect you." That dream was the only thing keeping her alive. But there was something about Elena that Cassandra didn't know. When Elena worked in the kitchen, she often hummed to herself. Soft melodies, simple lullabies her own mother had once sung to her when she was a child. She didn't even realize how beautiful her voice was, clear, warm, and filled with emotion that seemed to reach the very soul. Sometimes the cook or the gardener would stop what they were doing, listening secretly, afraid Cassandra might catch them. "Elena, your voice. It's like the radio singers," the gardener whispered one day. She shook her head quickly. "No, don't say that. Madam will be angry if she hears. I'm just humming." But fate has a way of exposing the hidden, even when we try to bury it. One evening, as Elena was cleaning the grand hallway, she began to sing softly to calm her child who was kicking inside her belly. She thought no one could hear. Her voice floated gently through the air like a feather carried by the wind. But Cassandra, descending the marble staircase, stopped. Her eyes narrowed. Instead of admiration, jealousy curled in her heart like poison. "A maid with a voice?" Cassandra whispered to herself. "How amusing. Maybe I can use this." From that moment, Elena's secret was no longer her own. The following days grew darker. Cassandra found new ways to humiliate her, making her scrub the floors in front of guests, criticizing her in public, and sneering whenever she walked by. But Elena stayed silent. For her baby she endured. For her baby she would endure everything. Still, every night when the house grew quiet, Elena pressed her hand to her belly and whispered, "Don't worry, my little one. Someday, things will be different. Someday, we will sing together under the stars." She didn't know then that her voice, the very gift she tried to hide, would soon become the center of her greatest humiliation. And also the reason her life would change forever, because Cassandra was already planning something. And at the grandest wedding the mansion would ever see, Elena would be forced to stand in front of hundreds of powerful, wealthy guests, pregnant, trembling, humiliated, and ordered to sing. And yet none of them knew that when her song filled the room, the millionaire himself would rise from his chair and do something that shocked everyone. The mansion wasn't just a home, it was a stage, and Cassandra, the millionaire's wife, was always the star. She lived for grand entrances, the click of her heels on polished marble, the shimmer of her diamond necklaces under the chandeliers. The way guests turned to look when she walked into a room, these were the things that fed her pride. Cassandra had married into wealth. She wasn't born with silver spoons, but she had the cunning to grab them when the opportunity came. The millionaire, Mr. Adrian Hale, had fallen for her charm years ago when she was still a hostess at a luxury gala. She had beauty, elegance, and most importantly, a sharp tongue that could bend conversations in her favor. But with time, Cassandra's beauty had turned into vanity, and her charm had sharpened into cruelty. The staff at the mansion lived in fear of her, whispering her name like one might whisper about a storm approaching, and Cassandra enjoyed it. Fear, she once told her closest friend, is respect in disguise. The city was buzzing with anticipation. Cassandra's only niece, the daughter of her wealthy sister, was getting married. The wedding wasn't just a union, it was a display of power, money, and social dominance. Hundreds of elite guests, business tycoons, and even government officials were expected to attend. For Cassandra, this wasn't her niece's wedding. This was her moment. The Hale family mansion would host the reception, and she intended to make it the most talked-about event of the year. Florists were hired from Italy. A French chef was flown in for the banquet. Musicians were lined up, but Cassandra wanted something different. Something people would gossip about for weeks. Something that would make her shine brighter than even the bride. And then she remembered Elena's voice. That maid. That pregnant, trembling girl who tried to hide her songs while scrubbing floors. Cassandra had heard her once, and it had left a mark. Not of admiration, but of envy. She couldn't stand the thought of a maid possessing something she didn't. A natural gift. But what better way to show her control than to force Elena into the spotlight, not as a singer celebrated for her voice, but as a servant mocked for her audacity. Yes, Cassandra whispered to herself as she looked at the guest list, her lips curling into a cruel smile. She will sing at the wedding, and everyone will laugh. The days leading up to the wedding were chaos for the staff. Cassandra barked orders from morning till midnight. Polish the silver twice. I don't want a single fingerprint. These roses are not the right shade of white. Send them back. Do you think this is good enough for me? For my family? Redo everything! But for Elena, the cruelty was sharper. Cassandra made her carry heavy trays despite her pregnancy, forced her to stay late polishing the floors, and even mocked her belly. Look at you, Cassandra sneered one afternoon, watching Elena struggle to reach the top of a shelf. Pregnant and still working, pathetic. If I were you, I'd be ashamed to even show my face. Elena lowered her eyes, holding back tears. She wanted to say, I'm doing this for my child. I'm proud, not ashamed. But the words stayed trapped in her throat. Then, just 3 nights before the wedding, Cassandra summoned her. Elena entered the master sitting room nervously, her hands wiping against her apron. Cassandra sat with a glass of wine in one hand and a sly smirk on her lips. You have a voice, don't you? Cassandra began. Elena froze. Madam, I just hum sometimes. Nothing more. Cassandra's laugh was like ice. Don't play the innocent with me. I heard you, and so will everyone else. At the wedding, you will sing for our guests. Elena's eyes widened in shock. Madam, please. I can't. I've never... You will. Cassandra's tone cut through the air. Do you know how many women would kill to stand in front of the most powerful people in this city? And here you are acting like it's a curse. You will sing, or you will pack your things and leave this house immediately. Elena's heart sank. She had nowhere else to go. No savings, no family nearby, no safety net. And she couldn't risk her child's future. With trembling lips, she whispered, Yes, madam. From that moment, Cassandra found wicked pleasure in reminding Elena of what awaited her. Practice, girl. Don't embarrass me in front of my guests. Wear something simple. I want them to see you're just a maid, not an artist. Smile when you sing. I want to see the shame in your eyes. She imagined the whispers of the guests, the laughter, the raised eyebrows as a maid, pregnant, no less, sang at such an extravagant event. To Cassandra, it would be entertainment, a show of her power to command even the lowest to perform. What she didn't realize was that sometimes humiliation backfires. Sometimes, the more you try to bury a star, the brighter it shines. Meanwhile, her husband Adrian watched quietly. Unlike Cassandra, Adrian was a man of fewer words. He was tall, silver-haired, with the calm authority of someone who had built an empire from nothing. Adrian had grown up poor, in a small village far from the glittering city lights. He had known hunger. He had known humiliation. He had known what it was like to be treated as invisible. And perhaps that was why Cassandra's treatment of Elena didn't sit well with him. Late at night, when Cassandra slept, Adrian sometimes walked the halls. Once, he paused outside the servants' quarters and heard it. The faint sound of Elena singing to her unborn child. Her voice was raw, filled with tenderness, a mixture of sorrow and hope. It stirred something deep in him, something he hadn't felt in years. He didn't say anything, not yet, but a seed had been planted in his heart. The mansion glittered with preparations. White roses lined the halls. Golden cutlery sparkled on long banquet tables, and the scent of freshly baked pastries drifted through the air. Guests began arriving from all corners of the country, and in the servants' quarters, Elena sat on her small bed, hands resting on her belly, tears staining her cheeks. She was terrified. The thought of standing in front of hundreds of strangers being mocked, humiliated, laughed at, it made her chest tighten. But when her baby kicked softly, as if reminding her he was there, Elena whispered, "For you, my little one, for you, I will endure this." She didn't know what awaited her. She didn't know that her humiliation would turn into the most shocking moment of her life. And she certainly didn't know that Adrian Hale, the millionaire himself, was quietly planning to stand up, not just for her voice, but for her dignity. The day of the wedding arrived like a storm. By early morning, the Hale mansion was transformed into a palace. White roses cascaded down the staircases, crystal chandeliers glowed brighter than ever, and the air was thick with the scent of expensive perfumes and gourmet dishes. Dozens of luxury cars pulled up at the gates, carrying the wealthiest, most influential guests of the city. To everyone, it was a day of celebration. But to Elena, it was a day of dread. She had been awake the entire night, unable to close her eyes, her hands trembling as she clutched her swollen belly. Every time she imagined herself standing before hundreds of strangers, her throat tightened. She wasn't a performer. She was just a maid. A maid who wanted to disappear into the shadows. But Cassandra had other plans. By noon, the mansion buzzed with activity. Servants rushed from room to room, balancing trays of champagne and desserts. Musicians tuned their instruments in the garden. Photographers prepared their cameras, and in the midst of it all, Cassandra swept through the halls like a queen. Dressed in a gown that shimmered like liquid gold, she gave orders with the flick of her hand. Place the orchids near the stage. Not there, are you blind? Tell the chef the appetizers are too salty. I want them redone immediately. And someone find that maid. She better not run away before her big performance. Her lips curled at the thought. Tonight, she would have her entertainment. When Elena was finally summoned, Cassandra's eyes gleamed. "Ah, there you are," she said, circling the young maid like a predator. "Look at you. Nervous already? Good. Remember, you're nothing without my permission. Tonight you will prove it to everyone." She handed Elena a plain white dress. It wasn't elegant. Not like the gowns worn by the guests. It was simple, almost like a servant's uniform, designed to remind everyone exactly who she was. Elena's hands shook as she held it. She wanted to refuse, to cry, to beg for mercy. But one look at Cassandra's cold eyes reminded her of the truth. If she refused, she would be thrown out on the streets, pregnant, alone. And so with tears she refused to let fall. She nodded. Yes, madam. By evening, the mansion was alive with music, laughter, and clinking glasses. Guests in glittering gowns and tailored suits mingled in the vast garden, sipping champagne beneath fairy lights that sparkled like stars. The bride, Cassandra's niece, glowed in a gown imported from Paris. The groom stood proudly by her side, shaking hands with businessmen and politicians. Everything was perfect, at least, it seemed perfect, because behind the scenes, Elena stood hidden in the corner, clutching her belly as her heart pounded against her ribs. She whispered to her unborn child, "Please, give me strength." At last, Cassandra stepped onto the stage, her voice amplified through the speakers. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said with a smile as sharp as glass, "thank you for joining us on this beautiful evening. Tonight we celebrate love, family, and the union of two wonderful souls. But before we raise our glasses, I have prepared something special." The crowd clapped politely, curious. Cassandra's smile widened. "We are honored tonight not only with a wedding, but with music. And who better to provide it than someone close to us? Someone who has been quietly hiding her talent." She turned her gaze toward Elena, who stood frozen at the edge of the stage. "Elena," Cassandra said sweetly, though her eyes were cruel. "Our maid. She will sing for us tonight." Gasps rippled through the audience. A maid? Singing at a wedding of this scale? Guests turned their heads, whispering behind jeweled fans and champagne glasses. Some smirked, expecting a disaster. Others shook their heads, pitying the poor girl. Elena's legs felt like stone as she was ushered onto the stage. The lights blinded her. Hundreds of eyes bore into her trembling figure. Her plain white dress looked even more humiliating under the chandeliers, a reminder that she didn't belong here. Her throat went dry. Her hands clutched her belly for strength. She could hear laughter, whispers, the clicking of cameras. And then Cassandra's voice rang in her ear, soft enough for only her to hear. "Sing, girl, or walk out of this house forever." Elena closed her eyes. For a moment, the world fell away. She wasn't standing in front of the rich and powerful. She wasn't trembling under Cassandra's gaze. She wasn't a maid, humiliated and afraid. She was a mother. She was a woman carrying life within her, and this song was for her child. Her lips parted, and a melody spilled into the air, soft at first, fragile like a whisper. But as the notes flowed, her voice grew stronger. It was pure, emotional. Each note carried the weight of her struggles, the pain of abandonment, the endurance of humiliation, and the fierce love of a mother. The garden grew silent. The laughter died. Even the musicians lowered their instruments, listening in awe. Guests who had smirked moments ago now sat with wide eyes, entranced by the sound. Her voice seemed to cut through every layer of pretense, every barrier of wealth and power, touching something raw inside each listener. And as Elena sang, tears welled in her eyes, not of shame, but of release. For once, she wasn't hiding. She wasn't small. She wasn't invisible. She was herself, but Cassandra's smile faltered. This wasn't what she had planned. She had expected laughter, mockery, whispers of, "How embarrassing." Instead, she saw jaws dropping, eyes glistening, and guests captivated. The humiliation she had prepared for Elena was slipping from her hands, her fingers tightened around her wine glass, her nails digging into her palm. "No," she hissed under her breath. "This is not how it's supposed to go." But it was too late. Elena's voice soared, reaching its final note, a note so clear and filled with emotion that the silence it left behind was deafening. And then, applause, loud, thunderous. Guests rose from their seats, clapping, cheering, some even wiping away tears. The maid had just stolen the show. In the midst of the applause, one pair of eyes shone brighter than the rest. Adrian Hale, the millionaire himself. He hadn't expected this. He had heard her voice before, faint and hidden in the night. But this was something else. It wasn't just music. It was truth, and as he rose slowly from his seat, all eyes turned to him. What would he do? Would he silence her? Scold her? Or something no one expected. Elena stood frozen, heart pounding, afraid of what was coming, and Cassandra, her face pale with fury, turned to her husband, certain he would restore order. But Adrian Hale was not a man who ignored the truth when it stared him in the face, and what he did next would shock everyone. The applause thundered across the garden, echoing off marble walls and crystal chandeliers. Guests clapped until their palms stung, some even rising to their feet in admiration. A few whispered to each other in disbelief. Who would have thought? The maid? Her voice. It's angelic. She sings better than the professionals. And in the middle of it all, Elena stood on the stage, trembling, her hands pressed protectively against her swollen belly. Tears streamed down her face, not from shame this time, but from the overwhelming release of years of pain, years of silence. She had sung her heart out, and for once, the world had listened. But while the crowd cheered, Cassandra sat stiff, her smile frozen, her eyes flashing with fury. This was not the humiliation she had planned. This was not the entertainment she had promised her guests. Instead of laughing at Elena, they were applauding her. Instead of mocking her, they were moved. Cassandra's jaw tightened. But then her gaze slid to her husband. Adrian Hale, the millionaire, had risen slowly from his chair. His tall figure loomed in the garden lights, his silver hair glowing faintly under the chandeliers. His expression was unreadable, neither smiling nor scowling, simply thoughtful, and suddenly the garden grew quieter. The applause softened as eyes turned to him, waiting. Everyone wanted to know, what would Adrian Hale do? Would he dismiss the maid's performance? Would he scold his wife for making such a ridiculous spectacle? Or would he surprise them all? Adrian did not speak right away. Instead, he remained still, his gaze fixed on Elena. She stood fragile and nervous, her chest rising and falling as she caught her breath, her tear-streaked face glowing with raw emotion. In that moment, Adrian saw something no one else did. He didn't see a maid. He didn't see a servant. He saw himself. Decades ago, before the money, before the empire he had built, Adrian had been poor, dirt poor, the kind of poor that left you hungry for days, the kind of poor that made people treat you like you were invisible. He remembered walking into classrooms where children laughed at his ragged clothes. He remembered working odd jobs at 14 just to put bread on the table. He remembered humiliation, and he remembered his mother. She too had sung in the evenings when there was nothing to eat, when the lights were too dim to read by. She had sung lullabies, not just to comfort him, but to remind herself that beauty could still exist even in suffering. Hearing Elena's voice now was like hearing his mother again. It pierced through the years, dragging him back to those nights when music was the only hope they had. Adrian's heart clenched. He clenched his fists, fighting the urge to speak immediately. He knew whatever he said now would ripple through this entire crowd. Words had power, and his voice carried weight in this city. But then another thought entered his mind. Cassandra. Adrian turned slightly, catching sight of his wife. Cassandra sat with her wineglass in hand, her smile brittle, her eyes sharp with warning. He knew her well. He had married her for her beauty once, her charm, her way of making him feel like a man of status when he was still climbing the ladder of success. But over the years he had seen beneath the surface. He had seen the cruelty, the arrogance, the way she treated others as though they were tools, not people. He had ignored it for too long. Business, reputation, appearances. He had convinced himself those things mattered more than correcting her behavior. But tonight, as he looked at Elena, humiliated and yet shining with dignity, he realized something. Silence made him complicit. If he stood by now, if he let Cassandra's cruelty continue unchecked, then he was no better than her. And yet, speaking up would mean war. Cassandra would never forgive public humiliation. Their marriage, already fragile, would shatter completely. The guests, too, would talk for months about the drama at the wedding. Adrian's mind weighed both paths. Stay silent, keep the peace, let the world move on, or speak and change everything. As Adrian remained silent, the crowd began to murmur again. Why isn't he saying anything? Surely he won't let this spectacle go on. Look at his face. He's thinking deeply. Elena stood frozen on the stage, her heart thudding painfully in her chest. She lowered her eyes, ashamed, convinced she had done something wrong. Had she embarrassed him? Had she overstepped? Would she be punished for daring to sing with her whole heart? Her body trembled. She wanted to run, to hide, to escape the crushing weight of hundreds of eyes. But her legs wouldn't move, and then a soft kick inside her belly reminded her, "Stay strong, Mama, stay strong." In that heavy silence, Adrian remembered a night from long ago. He had been no older than 10, sitting on a cold wooden floor in his childhood shack. His stomach had growled with hunger, but his mother had pulled him close, her arms thin but warm, and she had sung. Her voice had cracked, her eyes had glistened, but she had sung. And in that moment, Adrian had believed. He had believed that life could get better. That dreams, no matter how far, were worth chasing. Elena's voice had carried the same weight tonight, the same hope. How could he ignore that? Adrian inhaled deeply, his decision made. He stepped forward, his polished shoes clicking against the stone floor of the garden. The crowd hushed instantly, the air thick with anticipation. Cassandra straightened in her chair, panic flashing briefly in her eyes. "Adrian," she hissed under her breath, "don't you dare!" But Adrian did not look at her. His gaze was fixed on Elena, who still stood trembling under the lights. He walked toward the stage, each step deliberate, commanding. Guests leaned forward, holding their breath. What was he going to do? Was he about to shame the maid? Or something else entirely? On the stage, Elena's heart hammered as Adrian approached. She wanted to sink into the floor, to disappear. She was sure this was it. The end of her job, her shelter, her fragile hope. When he reached the stage, she lowered her head, whispering softly, "I'm sorry, sir. I didn't mean to." But Adrian lifted a hand, silencing her gently. The crowd leaned closer, and Cassandra's wine glass trembled in her hand. Adrian turned slowly, facing the crowd. His voice, when he finally spoke, was deep, steady, and filled with something no one had expected. "This young woman," he said, his hand gesturing toward Elena, "is not just a maid. She is a mother, a fighter, and tonight she has proven she carries a gift more valuable than gold." Gasps echoed through the garden. Cassandra's face drained of color. Adrian's words carried power. And with each sentence, the tension cracked like lightning across the wedding. What he said next would change not just Elena's life, but the entire Hale household forever, because Adrian Hale had made his choice, and his choice would shock everyone. The garden was silent. Hundreds of powerful eyes were fixed on Adrian Hale, the millionaire whose word could shift markets, whose decisions shaped the city. The applause for Elena's song had faded, leaving only the thrum of tension in the air. Elena, trembling on the stage, lowered her head. She couldn't bear to look at him. She expected scolding, dismissal, maybe even the end of her job. Cassandra's threats still echoed in her ears, "Sing, or leave this house forever." But Adrian's voice broke the silence, deep and commanding. "This young woman," he said, his words rolling across the garden like thunder, "is not just a maid. She is a mother, a fighter. And tonight, she has shown a courage most of us could never dream of." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Heads turned. Whispers erupted. What did he say? He's praising her? Is this really happening? Cassandra's smile froze on her lips, her wine glass trembling in her hand. She had expected Adrian to laugh, to dismiss the performance, to restore her control. Instead, he had done the unthinkable. He had turned the spotlight back on Elena, not as a spectacle of mockery, but as a star. She clenched her jaw, fury boiling inside her. "Adrian!" she hissed under her breath, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. "What are you doing?" But Adrian ignored her. He stepped closer to Elena, his tall figure standing beside her fragile one. He placed a hand lightly on her shoulder, not as a master to a servant, but as one human recognizing another. "Elena," he said softly, but the microphone carried his words to every corner of the garden. "You are more than the uniform you wear, more than the tasks assigned to you. Your voice is a gift, one that deserves to be heard, not hidden." Elena's lips trembled. Her knees threatened to give way. Never in her life had anyone spoken of her that way. For years she had been invisible, treated as less than human. And now, in front of the city's elite, the most powerful man she knew had lifted her higher than she ever dreamed. Her tears flowed freely, and for the first time, they weren't born of humiliation, but of hope. The guests began to murmur again, but this time their whispers were filled with admiration. Her voice really was incredible. "He's right. That girl has talent. Imagine hiding such a gem in a servant's uniform." Some clapped again, softer this time, in acknowledgement of Adrian's words. Others nodded thoughtfully, already picturing the headlines tomorrow. "Millionaire defends Maid at wedding." And though a few sneered, whispering about impropriety, their voices were drowned out by the awe spreading across the crowd. Cassandra's face flushed red. This was supposed to be her evening, her family's triumph. Instead, her husband had turned it into a stage for a maid. Her fingers dug into the stem of her glass until it nearly snapped. "You're embarrassing us," she spat at Adrian, her words sharp enough for those closest to hear. But Adrian finally turned to her, his expression steely. "No, Cassandra," he said firmly. "You embarrassed yourself, forcing a pregnant woman to perform for your amusement, humiliating her in front of our guests. That is shameful." The crowd gasped again. Cassandra's eyes widened in horror. Adrian had never spoken against her so openly, so publicly. Her carefully crafted mask cracked. For a moment, the woman who ruled the mansion with an iron tongue sat frozen, powerless. Adrian turned back to the guests, raising his hand for silence. The murmurs died instantly. His voice carried the authority of a man used to being obeyed. "From this night forward," he declared, "Elena will no longer serve as a maid in this house. She has a gift too rare to waste, and I will see to it personally that her voice reaches the world beyond these walls." The words struck the crowd like lightning. Elena gasped, her eyes wide. "Sir, I don't understand." Adrian looked at her with steady kindness. "You don't belong on your knees scrubbing floors, Elena. You belong on a stage where people can hear the truth in your voice. You reminded me tonight of something I had forgotten, that greatness can come from the humblest places. And I will not let that go unseen." Elena's hands flew to her mouth as sobs shook her body. She wanted to speak, to thank him, to say something, anything, but her voice failed her. She had dreamed of a better life for her child, but never had she imagined this. All she could whisper, through tears, was, "Thank you." "Thank you, sir." The garden erupted in applause once more, louder than before. Guests stood, clapping, some even cheering. Many of them were moved not just by Elena's song, but by Adrian's courage to defend her in front of everyone, including his own wife. It wasn't just admiration, it was respect. Respect for a man who, despite his wealth and power, remembered humanity. One guest, a music producer among the attendees, leaned over to another and whispered, "That girl could go far." I've never heard a voice like that. And just like that, the future Elena thought impossible began to unfold. But Cassandra was seething. Her humiliation burned hotter with every clap of the audience, every word of admiration directed at Elena. She stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the stone. "This is ridiculous," she shouted, her voice breaking through the applause. "She's a maid, Adrian." "A servant. You're making a fool of yourself and of us." The garden fell silent again. All eyes turned to her. Adrian faced her calmly, his voice low but firm. "No, Cassandra. The only fool here tonight is the one who thinks wealth makes them greater than another human being." The words landed like a blow. Cassandra's face twisted, caught between rage and disbelief. And the crowd, silent only seconds ago, broke into thunderous applause once more. In that moment, Elena pressed a hand to her belly. Her child kicked again, stronger this time, almost as if he understood. She whispered to herself, "Your life will be different, my little one." Mama's promise is coming true. Her tears sparkled under the chandeliers, and though she was still dressed in the plain white gown Cassandra had given her, she no longer looked like a maid. She looked like someone reborn. That night, the wedding was no longer remembered for its flowers, its food, or even the bride's gown. It was remembered for the moment when a millionaire's wife tried to humiliate a maid, and her husband turned the tables, lifting that same maid higher than anyone had expected. It was remembered for the voice that silenced a crowd and the man who chose justice over appearances. And it was remembered as the night when everything changed. Because from that night on, Elena's life would never be the same, and Cassandra's world would never recover. The applause still echoed in the night air when the music faded and the garden began to stir with chatter again. The guests looked around at one another, eyes wide, as if asking silently, "Did we really just witness this?" It was supposed to be an ordinary wedding reception, a show of luxury, a celebration of power. Instead, it had become a stage for something no one expected, a maid's voice, and a millionaire's defiance of his own wife. Clusters of guests huddled together, their words tumbling over each other in hushed tones. "Can you believe it? He defended a maid in front of everyone." She wasn't just a maid. Did you hear her voice? It gave me chills. And did you see Cassandra's face? I thought she was going to explode. For some, it was a scandal. For others, it was inspiring. But no one could deny it. The story would spread like wildfire by morning. One man, a businessman from the north, leaned toward his wife. "Mark my words, tomorrow's papers won't talk about the bride. They'll talk about this." Inside, Cassandra burned hotter than the candles flickering on every table. She had tried to compose herself, forcing a brittle smile as the guests whispered and pointed. But humiliation clung to her like a second skin. The wife who had built her identity on status and control now stood stripped of both, her authority torn away in one public declaration. She cornered Adrian as soon as she could, her voice sharp, her eyes blazing. "How dare you undermine me in front of everyone?" she hissed, keeping her words just low enough not to be overheard. Adrian's gaze didn't waver. "How dare you humiliate a woman carrying a child? Do you not see, Cassandra? Wealth is meaningless if it robs us of our humanity." Her lips curled, her pride unwilling to bend. "She's nothing, Adrian. A servant. And you—" She jabbed a manicured finger at his chest. "You've made us a laughingstock." But Adrian only shook his head. "No, Cassandra. Tonight we became something worth respecting. The only one laughingstock here is you." The words sliced through her, leaving her pale and shaking. For the first time in years, Cassandra felt the power shift out of her hands. Meanwhile, Elena sat quietly at the edge of the garden, her hands still trembling from the performance. Guests occasionally approached her, some with kind smiles, some with cautious curiosity. One woman bent close and whispered, "My dear, your voice. It's unforgettable. You should never let anyone silence you." Elena lowered her eyes, humbled, her heart still racing. She wanted to believe it was true, that this night could be the start of something new. But a voice inside her whispered doubt. "Can I really rise above this? I'm just a maid. I don't belong here." She pressed a hand to her belly, feeling her child stir again. For the first time, she whispered a different promise than before. "Maybe, little one, we are meant for something greater after all." Among the crowd, one guest lingered longer near Elena, a man with sharp eyes and a practiced ear. A music producer, known for discovering talent in unlikely places, had been sitting quietly during the performance, but he had heard every note. He introduced himself softly, sliding into the chair beside her. "Your voice," he said, "is rare. You sing with more than talent. You sing with soul. That's something you can't fake. Have you ever thought of singing professionally?" Elena blinked at him, stunned. Her cheeks flushed. "Professionally?" "No, sir, I wouldn't even know where to begin," he smiled. Perhaps you won't need to know. Perhaps all you need is a chance. Elena's heart raced. Could it be? Could the door to her dreams actually be opening? While Elena's world began to shift, Adrian stood apart from the crowd, speaking with only a handful of trusted friends. His face was calm, but inside he carried a storm. He had acted on instinct, on conscience, but he knew this choice would not come without consequences. Cassandra's anger would not fade easily, and society, for all its applause tonight, was fickle, but Adrian was firm. He would not back down. He had seen too much cruelty dressed in diamonds and arrogance. If he could use his wealth to correct even one injustice, then that was worth more than every fortune in his accounts. The night stretched on, but the balance had shifted permanently. Cassandra, once the undisputed queen of the evening, found herself isolated. Conversations quieted when she approached. Polite smiles masked hidden smirks. People who once flattered her now avoided her gaze. Her friends whispered behind their hands, "She went too far this time." Imagine humiliating a pregnant woman. How cruel. And her own husband corrected her in public. I've never seen anything like it. The more she tried to reclaim control, the deeper her humiliation grew. Her throne of influence had crumbled in a single night. As the guests began to leave, more than one pressed a kind word or encouragement into Elena's hands. Some promised to help. Others simply bowed their heads in respect, and though she still wore the plain white gown, she no longer felt invisible. She no longer felt small. For the first time in her life, Elena felt seen. Her tears that night were no longer bitter. They were cleansing, washing away years of shame. By the time the final guests departed, the story had already begun its journey beyond the walls of the mansion. Tomorrow it would race through the city like wildfire. Maid forced to sing at wedding, Millionaire's response stuns crowd. People would whisper, argue, admire, and criticize. But Elena's name, once known only in the kitchens and hallways of the Hale estate, would now begin to echo in places she had never dared to dream of. And Cassandra's cruelty, once hidden behind closed doors, was now exposed for all to see. Later that night, Adrian found Elena sitting quietly in the garden, the stars reflecting in her tear-streaked eyes. He sat beside her, his voice gentler now. "I meant what I said, Elena. You will not scrub floors in this house again. You deserve a future, and I will help you find it." Elena shook her head, overwhelmed. "Sir, I don't know how to thank you. You've changed my life." Adrian smiled faintly. "Don't thank me. Thank yourself. It was your courage, your voice, your strength that changed everything tonight. I only gave it the place it deserved." Elena's heart swelled, and she whispered the words she had carried in silence for years. "Maybe. Maybe my child will finally have a chance to live free." Elsewhere in the mansion, Cassandra stormed through the halls, her pride shattered, her anger uncontained. She threw off her jewelry, slammed her closet doors, paced until her heels wore grooves in the carpet. She replayed Adrian's words again and again, each one cutting deeper. "The only fool here is you." Her empire of appearances had cracked, and she vowed in the dark silence of her room that she would not forget. And she would not forgive, but deep down, she knew the truth. The tide had shifted, and no amount of rage could pull it back. As dawn touched the city, whispers turned into headlines, headlines into conversations, conversations into judgments. By morning, everyone knew. Some called it scandal. Some called it justice. But everyone agreed. It was unforgettable. And in the heart of it all, Elena held her belly and whispered to her child, "The world saw us tonight, and tomorrow we rise." The mansion was unusually quiet the morning after the wedding. No clinking glasses, no laughter echoing down the halls, no footsteps of busy servants rushing about. Instead, a heavy stillness hung in the air, like the calm after a storm. But for Elena, the silence was not heavy. It was liberating. For the first time in years, she awoke without the weight of servitude pressing down on her chest. She was still the same woman, still in the same simple room, but something inside her had shifted. The world had seen her. Her voice had been heard, And most importantly, someone had believed in her. She pressed a hand to her belly, whispering softly to her unborn child, "We're free now, free to dream." Meanwhile, in another wing of the mansion, Cassandra raged. The newspapers were already out, headlines plastered across the city, with her humiliation immortalized in ink. Millionaire defends pregnant maid at wedding. Cruelty backfires. Wife shamed for forcing maid to sing. Her phone buzzed, constantly with messages, friends canceling luncheons, charities withdrawing invitations, whispers of her name becoming synonymous with arrogance and cruelty. The society she had fought so hard to impress was now turning its back on her. And worse, Adrian had not come to her defense. He had not softened his words in the morning light. Instead, he had grown distant, his disappointment clearer than ever. Cassandra had lost not only her reputation, but her grip on her husband's respect. Adrian, however, was calm. For years he had allowed Cassandra's vanity to rule their home, excusing her cruelty for the sake of peace. But last night had stripped away every illusion. He sat in his office that morning, papers spread before him, a plan taking shape. His wealth, his influence, his connections, these were tools he had often used for business. Now he intended to use them for something greater. Elena's voice had reminded him of something he had buried long ago: compassion. And he would not waste this chance to set things right. Later that day, Adrian called Elena into his office. She entered hesitantly, her hands folded before her, her eyes lowered. "You asked to see me, sir?" she whispered. Adrian rose, offering her a chair. "Elena, I have spoken with Mr. Grant, the music producer who was at the wedding last night. He sees potential in you, more than potential. He believes with training and support you could build a career as a singer." Elena's eyes widened. "A career? Me?" Her voice cracked on the words. "Yes, you," Adrian said firmly. "You have a gift, Elena, and gifts are meant to be shared. If you choose, I will sponsor your lessons, arrange for you to meet the right people, and ensure you and your child are cared for during this journey." Tears filled her eyes. "Sir, I don't deserve this. I'm just—" "No," Adrian interrupted gently. "Don't say it. You are not just anything. You are a woman of strength, and your child deserves to see you rise." For a long moment, Elena sat in stunned silence. Then, slowly, she nodded. If this is God's will, then I will try. For my child." Weeks passed, and Elena's life began to transform. She no longer carried trays through the mansion or scrubbed floors until her hands bled. Instead, she sat in studios, learning scales and breathing techniques. She stood before mentors who taught her to trust her own power. At first, her voice wavered with nerves. But soon, the strength that had stunned a garden full of guests returned, steadier and more radiant than before. She was no longer singing because she was forced. She was singing because she was free, and every note carried the weight of her journey, the pain of humiliation, the courage of defiance, the hope of a better life. Cassandra, meanwhile, withered in the shadows of her own making. The society pages that once adored her now mocked her. Invitations dried up, friends avoided her, and whispers followed her wherever she went. She tried to reclaim her throne, hosting luncheons and parties, but fewer and fewer people attended. And those who did only came to gawk, to whisper, to relish her downfall. Worst of all, she could no longer control Adrian. He had drawn a line she could not cross, and for the first time in their marriage, she felt powerless. In her heart, bitterness grew, a poison she could not spit out. She blamed Elena for everything, though deep down she knew the truth. Her own cruelty had destroyed her. Months later, Elena's first performance outside the mansion was announced. A small charity event, nothing grand, but for Elena it was a mountain. She stood backstage, nerves racing, hands trembling as they had the night she sang at the wedding. But this time, she wasn't alone. Her baby, now born, slept peacefully in a basket beside her, and Adrian, standing just off stage, gave her an encouraging nod. "You're ready. he whispered. Elena stepped into the lights. Her voice filled the hall, not with fear, but with power. The audience sat in awe, the same awe that had once silenced the wedding guests. And when she finished, they rose to their feet in thunderous applause. Tears streamed down Elena's face. She had done it. She had transformed her pain into music, her humiliation into triumph. That night, as she held her baby close, Elena whispered, "We are free now, my love. No one will ever call you less than worthy, because tonight the world heard us." Her child stirred, tiny fingers curling around hers, and Elena knew the future would be brighter than she ever dreamed. Watching Elena's journey, Adrian felt something stir within him too. In helping her, he had rediscovered his own humanity. Wealth had always been his shield, his fortress. But Elena had reminded him that true power wasn't in money. It was in kindness, in lifting others when they were cast down. He vowed from that day on to use his fortune not just for business, but for people like Elena, people who needed a voice. In the end, the wedding was remembered not for its lavish flowers or golden chandeliers. It was remembered for the night a cruel wife tried to humiliate a maid. And the maid's voice rose above it all. It was remembered for the moment Adrian Hale shocked everyone, not with wealth or spectacle, but with compassion. And it was remembered as the night Elena's destiny changed forever. Cassandra faded slowly into obscurity. Her name a cautionary tale whispered in elite circles. Arrogance had been her crown, but it had crumbled under the weight of her own cruelty. Elena, on the other hand, blossomed. Her songs reached beyond the mansion, beyond the city, touching hearts that had never known her struggles but felt her strength in every note. She had been a maid. She had been humiliated. But she had risen. And in the end, the world did not remember her as a servant. The world remembered her as a singer, as a mother, as a woman who triumphed against cruelty. And so, from a night of humiliation, was born a story of hope. A millionaire's wife tried to silence a pregnant maid, but instead, her voice sang louder than ever, and what the millionaire did that night truly shocked everyone. The mansion was unusually quiet the morning after the wedding. No clinking glasses, no laughter echoing down the halls, no footsteps of busy servants rushing about. Instead, a heavy stillness hung in the air, like the calm after a storm. But for Elena, the silence was not heavy. It was liberating. For the first time in years, she awoke without the weight of servitude pressing down on her chest. She was still the same woman, still in the same simple room, but something inside her had shifted. The world had seen her. Her voice had been heard, and most importantly, someone had believed in her. She pressed a hand to her belly, whispering softly to her unborn child, "We're free now, free to dream." Meanwhile, in another wing of the mansion, Cassandra raged. The newspapers were already out, headlines plastered across the city, with her humiliation immortalized in ink. Millionaire defends pregnant maid at wedding? Cruelty backfires. Wife shamed for forcing maid to sing. Her phone buzzed, constantly with messages, friends canceling luncheons, charities withdrawing invitations, whispers of her name becoming synonymous with arrogance and cruelty. The society she had fought so hard to impress was now turning its back on her. And worse, Adrian had not come to her defense. He had not softened his words in the morning light. Instead, he had grown distant, his disappointment clearer than ever. Cassandra had lost not only her reputation, but her grip on her husband's respect. Adrian, however, was calm. For years he had allowed Cassandra's vanity to rule their home, excusing her cruelty for the sake of peace. But last night had stripped away every illusion. He sat in his office that morning, papers spread before him, a plan taking shape. His wealth, his influence, his connections, these were tools he had often used for business. Now he intended to use them for something greater. Elena's voice had reminded him of something he had buried long ago: compassion. And he would not waste this chance to set things right. Later that day, Adrian called Elena into his office. She entered hesitantly, her hands folded before her, her eyes lowered. "You asked to see me, sir?" she whispered. Adrian rose, offering her a chair. "Elena, I have spoken with Mr. Grant, the music producer who was at the wedding last night. He sees potential in you, more than potential. He believes with training and support you could build a career as a singer." Elena's eyes widened. "A career? Me?" Her voice cracked on the words. "Yes, you," Adrian said firmly. "You have a gift, Elena, and gifts are meant to be shared. If you choose, I will sponsor your lessons, arrange for you to meet the right people, and ensure you and your child are cared for during this journey." Tears filled her eyes. "Sir, I don't deserve this. I'm just—" "No," Adrian interrupted gently. "Don't say it. You are not just anything. You are a woman of strength, and your child deserves to see you rise." For a long moment, Elena sat in stunned silence. Then, slowly, she nodded. If this is God's will, then I will try. For my child." Weeks passed, and Elena's life began to transform. She no longer carried trays through the mansion or scrubbed floors until her hands bled. Instead, she sat in studios, learning scales and breathing techniques. She stood before mentors who taught her to trust her own power. At first, her voice wavered with nerves. But soon, the strength that had stunned a garden full of guests returned, steadier and more radiant than before. She was no longer singing because she was forced. She was singing because she was free, and every note carried the weight of her journey, the pain of humiliation, the courage of defiance, the hope of a better life. Cassandra, meanwhile, withered in the shadows of her own making. The society pages that once adored her now mocked her. Invitations dried up, friends avoided her, and whispers followed her wherever she went. She tried to reclaim her throne, hosting luncheons and parties, but fewer and fewer people attended. And those who did only came to gawk, to whisper, to relish her downfall. Worst of all, she could no longer control Adrian. He had drawn a line she could not cross, and for the first time in their marriage, she felt powerless. In her heart, bitterness grew, a poison she could not spit out. She blamed Elena for everything, though deep down she knew the truth. Her own cruelty had destroyed her. Months later, Elena's first performance outside the mansion was announced. A small charity event, nothing grand, but for Elena it was a mountain. She stood backstage, nerves racing, hands trembling as they had the night she sang at the wedding. But this time, she wasn't alone. Her baby, now born, slept peacefully in a basket beside her, and Adrian, standing just off stage, gave her an encouraging nod. "You're ready," he whispered. Elena stepped into the lights. Her voice filled the hall, not with fear, but with power. The audience sat in awe, the same awe that had once silenced the wedding guests. And when she finished, they rose to their feet in thunderous applause. Tears streamed down Elena's face. She had done it. She had transformed her pain into music, her humiliation into triumph. That night, as she held her baby close, Elena whispered, "We are free now, my love. No one will ever call you less than worthy." Because tonight the world heard us. Her child stirred, tiny fingers curling around hers, and Elena knew the future would be brighter than she ever dreamed. Watching Elena's journey, Adrian felt something stir within him too. In helping her, he had rediscovered his own humanity. Wealth had always been his shield, his fortress. But Elena had reminded him that true power wasn't in money. It was in kindness, in lifting others when they were cast down. He vowed from that day on to use his fortune not just for business, but for people like Elena, people who needed a voice. In the end, the wedding was remembered not for its lavish flowers or golden chandeliers. It was remembered for the night a cruel wife tried to humiliate a maid. And the maid's voice rose above it all. It was remembered for the moment Adrian Hale shocked everyone, not with wealth or spectacle, but with compassion. And it was remembered as the night Elena's destiny changed forever. Cassandra faded slowly into obscurity, her name a cautionary tale whispered in elite circles. Arrogance had been her crown, but it had crumbled under the weight of her own cruelty. Elena, on the other hand, blossomed. Her songs reached beyond the mansion, beyond the city, touching hearts that had never known her struggles but felt her strength in every note. She had been a maid. She had been humiliated. But she had risen. And in the end, the world did not remember her as a servant. The world remembered her as a singer, as a mother, as a woman who triumphed against cruelty. And so, from a night of humiliation, was born a story of hope. A millionaire's wife tried to silence a pregnant maid, but instead, her voice sang louder than ever, and what the millionaire did that night truly shocked everyone.